Well, welcome everybody to the series Thriving Through the Decade of Disruption. It's been a really interesting series this year, just trying to work out how do we, within the university context, help industry, help government, help ourselves, even within universities, to work out how do we help people sort of, I guess, respond to this once in a generation sort of opportunity or crisis. And I'm really excited tonight to have Professor David Gann and Professor Mark Dodgson. David, we're very grateful. Both of them are coming to us from the UK. David is the incoming Pro Vice Chancellor and a Professor in Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Oxford University, which doesn't need too much mentioning, and is just finishing up a very long tenured position at Imperial College, University, another very prestigious university. And Professor Mark Dodgson, again, a Professor in Innovation Studies at the University of Queensland. Both of these two guys, have written, extensively on innovation and entrepreneurship, and not only written about it, but actually created companies and worked with companies, multinationals all around the world. So I feel very privileged to be able to have a conversation with them. And in reality, what I really want to talk about today, and why I've asked David and Mark to lend us some of their very early morning time, is really about what is that role that universities can play to really help our economies that those universities are embedded in to really respond to this crisis that we're in. And I know that both David and Mark, write for the World Economic Forum, and they've written 3 really interesting pieces over the last few months, really trying to, I guess, stimulate a conversation around the role of universities in responding to COVID and effectively what's been called the Great Reset. We had this one opportunity where everything's been unsettled and disrupted. And therefore, we had this great opportunity to really look at that reset and what is the role for universities. And so, David, I guess I want to just lead off the conversation with yourself and just ask the question, what are you seeing from a UK point of view as to the role that universities are stepping into, and how are they having to pivot to be able to really help places like the UK be able to respond to this situation?
Yes, thank you, Cameron, and good evening, everyone. Delighted to be participating with you. Look forward to your questions and comments. Just responding to your question, Cameron, the UK has not had a uniform response from the universities, and I think the first thing to understand in the UK context is that some universities, a few universities, have actually responded very quickly and benefited in some senses, if one can benefit from such a dreadful set of issues that the pandemic has thrown up, and are doing a lot of things that are both helping the pandemic and keeping the university running. Others have really been struggling. And so the first image I want to give you from the UK is that it's not a uniform picture. So we might ask the question, why is it that some universities in the same setting have been able to move forward and make progress and contribute so well? And rather obvious answer is that they already had within themselves, first of all, the right types of science that were required to address and tackle some of the issues that have been thrown up by the coronavirus crisis. Secondly, and I think, Mark, you may well come on and comment on this, they had a cultural disposition and a set of structures and organizational approaches to being entrepreneurial, which allowed them to move faster than others. And I think the combination of having deep science that is highly credible and required at the moment, and an ability to turn that science into useful outcomes has allowed a few universities. I'm blessed actually completely by accident to be working at the 2 headline universities that have come out very well at the moment, Imperial College and now Oxford University. And I can give you a little bit more sense of what they're doing and how they're doing it as we go through the conversation.
Yeah, great, David. Mark, you've actually, got a very unique position in that you're obviously a professor at the University of Queensland, but you spend quite a lot of time in the UK at Imperial College. Interested in your perspectives of maybe setting us in the context of this entrepreneurial university and what you've seen in the UK, and maybe what is the challenge for us and the opportunity for us in Australia.
Thank you, Cam, and thank you for inviting us to talk. I think that David's message is very a powerful one and important for Australia, that you can survive and thrive in these circumstances. And you do see some universities in the UK that are actually teaching more students this year than they were last year, raising more money in philanthropy, encouraging, receiving substantial grants from government. And others are facing very severe existential threats. They really are in a very difficult situation. And I think the challenge is really for Australian universities to see what the successful universities are doing around the world and how they are dealing with the crisis, taking the opportunity of the crisis. And I must say that I read the Australian newspaper every day, and I read the letters coming in from readers after any article on universities, and the negative tone of the general population to universities in Australia can be quite terrifying sometimes. So I think what this crisis has provided is an opportunity to really demonstrate the value that universities can produce for Australian society. Not only in being able to deal with the crisis in all its forms, so from creating new vaccines and test and trace systems and dealing with issues of cybersecurity and personal security around those kind of systems, but to how you rebuild an economy afterwards, and using the language of the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset. How do you produce a greener and fairer economy? And universities have got a real opportunity to contribute to that debate and really show the value that they can produce for Australian society. So I think, although there are many concerns, and I've seen the statistics from Universities Australia on potential job losses, and that's very depressing. And despite the government's investment of $1 billion into research, there really isn't a huge amount of money and to deal with the scale of the problem that is confronted. So it's really a question, I think, of looking at the best practice you can see around the world, see where universities are succeeding, and trying to emulate that. And I'm sure this is one of the issues that we'll come on to, but one of the features of successful universities in the UK that are actually really demonstrating their value are those that have a very strong entrepreneurial mindset. And we'll probably come on to that.
Yeah, and that's a great opportunity to segue into that, because I guess what I'm interested in is this. I find this interesting sort of scenario where the pharmaceutical industry is enormous. I mean, it's very, very big. And I find it somewhat ironic, really, that we sit ourselves here and we've got Imperial, we've got University of Queensland, which is this, university in down under, a long way away, and you've got Oxford University, which is obviously no surprise, all with leading candidates for a potential vaccine. I guess I'm interested in this position that we find ourselves in. What does this say to, I guess, the relevance of universities in the broader ecosystem? Like, why didn't all of these drugs come out of pharmaceutical companies? What is it about universities that put us in that position to be able to offer these opportunities?
Two interesting things come out of that comment and question, Cameron. One is that leading scientists, first of all, they work at good universities, and UQ, Imperial and Oxford are very strong universities in terms of their capabilities, their resources, their laboratories, and so on. Secondly, they don't work on their own mainly, they collaborate. And one of the extraordinary things in the last year has been how exposed the international community has been in its inability to deal collectively with the virus and its consequences. Indeed, many of the organizations that you would hope would be providing leadership have been under attack, like the World Health Organization. And aside from that, the scientific community have largely been incredibly collaborative. And so you may feel, or we may feel, that we're quite a long way apart in distance geographically. between Queensland and London, or the south of England. But actually, in terms of scientific collaboration, we're very tightly coupled. And that didn't happen suddenly. It happens because that's how science develops. And one of the great strengths of the scientific community is its ability to continue to collaborate through crises like this. So I think the other side of this is how we portray that and how quickly we can cohere to build the teams that need to tackle the pandemic in detail. And clearly there are a number of areas that need work on urgently. We talked about vaccines, and yes, it would be lovely to have a vaccine, but let's just remind ourselves that Imperial was one of the first universities to discover AIDS, HIV, and we still don't have a vaccine for that. And one of the leading professors at Imperial has been working all his life, 35 years, trying to develop a vaccine for the common cold, and we still don't have a vaccine for that. So although there's been some very good progress and the indications look good in terms of creating a vaccine for coronavirus, there's no certainty that we're going to succeed with this. And that means that we need other tools to manage the virus. And these top universities are also providing a lot of the science that's required to build those tools. We need to be able to diagnose quickly, so diagnostic capabilities. We need other types of drugs to tackle the symptoms and to offset the worst causes that happen to your body from the virus. And we need track and trace. We need to be able to understand how quickly this is spreading. And I'm pleased to say that our teams have been working on all of those developments. And that's because we don't just do one thing. And when you talk about pharmaceutical companies, they have a different rhythm. They have a lot of investments in particular areas with big bets. And sometimes they're slower to react, actually. And they might not have the comprehensive range of different capabilities. And sometimes they're not as collaborative as the scientific capabilities in our universities, because they have a different culture and a different requirement to protect their intellectual property. So we need actually to see collaboration, and Oxford has been collaborating very closely with AstraZeneca, and it's changed AstraZeneca's view of the world, I think, very quickly. And that wouldn't have happened if the pandemic hadn't occurred.
Yeah, look, I think that's great. And Mark, I'll get you to answer to this in responding to that. But I guess I'm just wondering, what is that situation caused in terms of, and Mark, have a crack at this, in terms of how has that changed universities? How is universities going to be different? Have we learned something? This is a big experiment. We're all in the middle of this big experiment. Has that change, that change created a new opportunity for universities to say, okay, we're going to learn from this and we're going to move in a different direction? Mark?
Sure. I think I'd just like to echo David's point about the collaboration. I was on a conference call 2 weeks ago with Dr. Fauci in the US, and he said in all his experience of working in health for 50 odd years, he'd never seen such close and quick collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. He said that there are so many examples of private sector companies changing their behaviors and universities changing their behaviors in order to be able to deal with this crisis. The focus of dealing with the crisis had created a point of overlap and mutual benefit, which focused their collaboration. And I think one of the things that David and I have done studies over many years of successful clusters of innovative activity around regions or countries, we see that the most successful ones is where all the players involved in an innovation ecosystem are aligned. And that would be the large company, the one that's got the resources and the supply chains and the regulatory experience. It would be the small firms with their speed and their flexibility and agility. It would be the universities or the research laboratories with the ideas. And it would be government at all levels, working together, coordinating and being able to produce benefits. And I think one of the lessons that we need to take away from this, from the university's perspective, is that they are crucial players in let's call them entrepreneurial ecosystems. The systems around universities involving finance, involving other capabilities in manufacturing or distribution, involve legal ability, capabilities to deal with IP and contracts and so forth. And being an important part of that and being able to play a role as a convener out of those ecosystems is a very important thing for universities to do. And good universities have been doing it. I think there's many lessons that can be learned on how to do it better. And I think to answer your question, I think one of the things that universities can take away from this crisis is really to better understand their role as conveners in those entrepreneurial ecosystems, and to think in practice, how can they actually improve the performance of the system?
Yeah. Let me just add 2 points to Mark's response to you, which I completely agree, Mark. The other things you need are some of the machinery inside the university to signal what's going on. You need a communications department function that is not just being reactive. Cameron, you mentioned that there's criticism of universities in the press in Australia. I can assure you the universities in Britain have been under attack from quite a large segment of the media. But if you're going to be doing something, you need to be able to get on the front foot in the public eye. And I know that people who run both Imperial's and Oxford's communications functions, and almost, I think, every day in all the main newspapers and radio and news channels, you will see a leading scientist from one or other or both of those institutions, not just in the UK, but on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. You'll see them using all the media channels. And that takes team effort. We're talking about communications teams of sort of 40, 50 people in each case, working very long hours, responding to the negatives, but also influencing by using the positive channels and getting those messages out there. So it's not just about doing something good in isolation or in the ivory tower. You have to be on the front foot in the public eye and in engaging with what's happening. And there's a lot of fake news stoked up, sometimes by some world leaders. And one has to tell truth to that. And that's another side to the role of universities. Now, if you do those things, you create the conditions where other good things will happen for your institution. So I know that both Imperial and Oxford have received large philanthropic gifts very, very rapidly over the last 6 months that were not asked for. They came because wealthy people wanted to help in this crisis, and they trusted those institutions to use those gifts wisely and quickly in fighting the pandemic. That doesn't happen to everyone. You have to have all of those conditions in place. People want to see their gifts used and see some public good come from it. So if you're going to make your luck, you have to create the infrastructure in the university that will allow that to happen.
Yeah. And I guess one thing I want to sort of move the conversation towards is we've always done, places like Oxford and Imperial, top 10 or top 5 universities in the world, always been exceptional at research. I mean, Oxford, the oldest university in the world, always had very good research. And I guess what I'm interested in, and David, I think you're in a unique position sort of on this intersection between Imperial and Oxford. Imperial's a younger university, but being very successful at research commercialization and research translation. I guess I'm interested in what does, and I know we've talked a number of times about what Imperial are doing in terms of incentivizing academics to be able to obviously get more commercialization, more translation out there. Interested in your thoughts or your suggestions or encouragement for us to think about what does a university, what are the internal policies to try and accelerate this translation? Because in some ways, the criticism of universities is somewhat justified because we spend lots of money, we do lots of research, but a lot of universities have not been really good at translation. Now, UQ's actually done very well, but still we spend a lot of money on research. And I guess the universities, the governments, the UK government's led this charge and the Australian government's following in hot pursuit. of encouraging, almost forcing universities to get better at translation. What have you learned in terms of your experience at Imperial, so in terms of new structures that a university has to embrace to accelerate that translation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And first of all, whilst I think we've got some metrics that show that Imperial and Oxford are good at this, they're by no means as good as I would like them to be. And that means that this is a journey. It means they can be an awful lot better because we know where they can improve. And so they're not the finished article at all in terms of what we call the third stream of university activity. I mean, we have teaching and research, which are the core activities that most people think about. But, you know, engaging to have impact with social purpose and economic purpose is the third stream. And, you know, during my career, I've seen the culture of some parts of the academic world change, partly because we've tried to measure and reward people and have the right incentives in place in people's career structures. And partly because I think academics themselves in certain disciplines have wanted to have more impact and make a difference. And that's always been the case. But from time to time, you know, the pendulum swings and people think impact is publishing a paper in a top journal. Well, that's a pathway to doing one's science properly. It's not the final result of that science. And I think we need academics with the capability to do all three. You can't do that all in the same year at the same time when you're beginning. But, you know, you've got some stellar academics at UQ who embody, you know, great capability in research. They're wonderful teachers and they make a big difference to the world. And we need to bring on the next cadre of academics who can do that. But we need to create the conditions where they can do that. And Mark, you know, we've been looking at the sort of facilities that people need if they want to make ideas happen. We need to have the right mentoring and coaching. We need people to be able to work in small teams. When I developed White City campus in London, we created the invention rooms and hack spaces. At the beginning, about 1,000 of our community each year were building prototypes somewhere or another in the university. And we quickly got that to 3,000 because we created the facilities where people could prototype. Universities have to make some investment so that people have the tools that they need and the capabilities that they need if they want to translate their ideas. And we also ought to say a little bit about translation because, you know, very quickly we have this image in our mind that it's all about starting up a company or spinning an idea out. Actually, a far larger proportion of translation happens in collaboration with existing companies. And to do that, one has to build relationships. And, you know, this question about AstraZeneca and Oxford or other pharmaceutical companies, Novartis put its headquarters right next to our campus. Why did it want to do that? That was their decision. They want to be close to the science. And that's because they know our scientists will collaborate and it's going to come across the boundary much more easily if they're close by. And those things take time and you have to build for that.
Yeah, that's great, David. And Mark, tell us a little about, from an entrepreneurial mindset point of view, what are you thinking is if we were to fast forward, let's just say there's, you know, you talked about this tension between universities that are embracing, and David, you mentioned some universities doing better than others. If we were to fast forward maybe 5 years from now and wondering those universities that have really taken this opportunity and changed and pivoted and thrived, what does that university look like in 5 years' time? How is it different to what it is now?
I'm sorry, Cam, I lost all that.
Oh, sorry. I guess I'm just wondering, if we fast forward, say 5 years' time from now, what does an entrepreneurial a university that takes this opportunity to change and pivot, modify itself, can you describe what that university looks like in the year 2025?
Okay, well, I mean, I think this is a journey. I think you're not going to change overnight. Universities have cultures and practices and processes and procedures, it's a long journey. But I mean, obviously you need to get all the right spaces in place. And one of the great features of Imperial College's innovation campus at White City is it's got a whole range of spaces from the very, very beginning to stimulate ideas right through to scale spaces where you're growing companies. So getting the spaces right is important. Having the right policies in place so that you don't overly restrict the flow of knowledge and IP out of the university into external places. Encouraging student entrepreneurs, encouraging staff to be entrepreneurs with mentorship programs and things like that. So, and also the question of education and training. I mean, as a PhD student in Imperial College in 1982, I was teaching engineers courses in entrepreneurship and innovation. That was 40 years ago nearly, and they knew at that stage that engineers needed to know about entrepreneurship and innovation, something that maybe some universities are still lessons that they're still learning. So there's been this long period of engagement, and the business school at Imperial College, for example, has always been very focused on innovation and entrepreneurship, and teaches many degrees and programs. And that having that long stream of programs, I know UQ's got 100 of courses across all faculties in innovation and entrepreneurship. Stanford University has 150 courses in entrepreneurship. So preparing the ground by teaching students across all the different disciplines about what innovation and entrepreneurship means, both in the business sense and in social entrepreneurship, about how to produce value for society as well as economic value. So I think it's a question of getting all those facilities right, getting all those policies right, and a question of getting all those education and training programs right.
Great, thanks. And just before I go on, if those of you that are watching, if you've got a question, just drop it in the Q&A, and we'll come to those questions soon. But David, can you tell us a little bit about, maybe give us a case study of a story where it's worked really well, where the university has spun something out, and it's actually now playing a significant role. I mean, we know about the vaccines, but tell us about some of the other, or maybe one of the other stories that you've got that's really demonstrated.
Let me tell you about a company called DNA Nudge, because I've worked with them so closely, and it's easy for me to tell. And it's also a very pertinent story for the coronavirus situation that we're in. So this company, first of all, the leading academic is one of Imperial's top scientist engineers. He created the bioengineering department about 30 years ago at Imperial College, and that tells you something, doesn't it? He's unusual. He created a bioengineering department, which is about biological sciences and engineering. So he straddles disciplines. He's interested in multiple questions. And on his illustrious journey, he became the Regius Professor, the Queen's Professor of Engineering, and which is a very high accolade in the UK. And he's created a number of companies. His most recent company, set of companies, have been created on a platform that processes DNA samples in a little device in the field. And he originally created this. He designed the chip and the whole lab on a chip process to tackle hospital-acquired infections. And I don't know quite what the incidence is in Australia, but I know that if you have to go into hospital in the UK for an operation, there's probably an equal chance of being killed by an infection as anything else. So one of the problems here is getting a quick diagnostic, and his lab on a chip would give you a result on that infection within less than an hour. Now, that was a number of years ago, and we helped him to create a suite of companies on the back of that device, because we created the facilities in our innovation campus for him to grow. It was his businesses that grew, but we had the facilities connected to science that allowed that to happen. Eventually, he created a nutrition company that takes a saliva test and will isolate a number of the DNA traits that signal whether you're likely to have diabetes or lactose intolerance or what have you. And when the coronavirus happened, he thought, I can convert this chip to detect COVID-19. And I worked with him on the medical approval side. He did the science. And within 9 weeks, we built, tested, and had approved a medical diagnostic device. And we're able to move that out into our hospitals to test nurses coming into the nursing station while they're having a cup of coffee to see if they're free from the virus before they go into the wards to work with people. And about 2 months ago, he received a government contract for £161 million to provide some 5 million tests in the health service in the UK. Now, that's created extraordinary stress in a small entrepreneurial company, because scaling that quickly in a crisis is probably as difficult as getting the science right. And so putting the right business support and business conditions around that company is something else that I've helped with and that Imperial College has within its network. He's just employed an excellent person from McKinsey, former GSK executive, who understands how to manage the supply chain and the market to build those devices quickly and get that scaled out. So there's a little case study for you, Cam, of a company that was doing very nicely, came out of our labs, extraordinary academic who built it, that was able to pivot very, very quickly. And it wouldn't have done it on its own if it was sitting somewhere in a small town out in the provinces. It was able to do it because all of the infrastructure was sitting there. And even then, it was extraordinarily difficult to make that happen.
Yeah. And in some ways, I guess, what I'm interested in is, we've got lots of great medical technologies and we've got this vaccine and some of these diagnostics, but in some ways I'm wondering at a broader perspective, a lot of these universities, are very multidisciplinary. We've got food faculties, we've got engineering, we've got social science. I guess I'm just wondering, what are some of the things that we could do to try and accelerate or leverage the translation of all these ideas? I mean, we've got this mass disruption. It's like almost an extinction event. A whole heap of companies have become extinct overnight. Even industry sectors have become extinct overnight. I guess I'm trying to work out, what can we do to try and respond profoundly more quickly than what we are at the moment, to be able to get more economic activity out of our universities. We've got great food researchers at the University of Queensland. They're doing lots of really cool stuff in food. It's not going to save anyone's life, but there's things around diabetes control, about weight management, and a lot of these things have been stuck in the university and just finding it hard to get out. Can you see a different paradigm, a different model, and how do we incentivize that to actually find a way to get out faster?
Do you want me to start, Mark? Let's just be realistic. Most ideas at that stage in their development fail. And so, first of all, we have to have an enormous throughput of ideas. And we have to have that resilience and appetite in our organizations and amongst our academics and our students to actually give it a go. But we have to be realistic that there are a lot of good universities out there. You can probably list on one page the number of unicorn companies that have actually been created in the last 10 years by ideas that have flown out of those universities. And that's because it's so difficult to do. Or it's also because many of those ideas are good ideas, but they're never going to grow that big. Or they're lookalikes that just contribute incrementally to what we already know. That's not to say that we shouldn't be trying. And as I said earlier, a better route for many of those ideas is in closer proximity to companies that already have access to good markets. And we see far more ideas flowing from Imperial College through the collaborations that we have with existing technology businesses. Or even selling or licensing out to those companies than we do from our startup community. In some senses, prioritizing and spotlighting DNA Nudge, you're picking one success out of a myriad of failures and celebrating it, which is wonderful. But what we're forgetting there is that it's the outlier. and it's the outlier that we really want to see succeed. The everyday event are the wonderful contributions that our engineers make to increments in bridge design, or water systems, or digital technologies that are part of someone else's technology set. And I think, you know, we also need to have those systems in place, and we need to have professors and students who are thoroughly engaged with companies that are themselves striving to innovate and trying to develop their own systems and technologies. And that's a big job of work. Imperial College has a large team in the corporate partnership area with customer account management, which spend a lot of time. We have about 500 companies that are regularly supporting our research. And when I was responsible for it, we had targets to increase our research income from the corporate world year on year. We're level pegging or thereabouts with MIT in terms of money coming in for fundamental research from companies. I don't think it's enough. You know, there's $1 trillion spent in R&D by the top 1,000 research companies in the world. How much of that flows into our universities? Not nearly enough. Why is that? Because the universities are not fit for purpose for turning that around quickly. They don't have the right culture. They don't have the right systems in place. Or you might not even be located in the right place. And unfortunately, UQ is not sat right in the middle of the densely packed areas with headquarters of big companies around. So you have to do something different to get out to those companies. You have to move around, or you have to communicate digitally to make yourself known and build those relationships. I'll hand over to Mark if you want to add something there, Mark.
Well, I mean, yes, of course, what you say is right. And how do you accelerate it? Well, coming back to Cam's first point, virtually every discipline in the university can contribute to the Great Reset. You know, we need historians to explain to us how societies rebuilt after previous pandemics. You know, we need psychologists to be able to help us come out of the trauma of self-isolation and social distancing. We need ethicists to talk about how the data is used for track and trace systems. And we need humanities to be able to teach us about the kind of world that we might want to build after the pandemic. And we need all that expertise. And yes, it needs to feed into the outside world more efficiently. How we do that? Well, it's only going to be, as David said, a small proportion of the total number of ideas that can possibly flow through. But there are some things you can do. And one of the things you can do is to encourage that entrepreneurship training and mindset in universities, where students from all different disciplines work together in interdisciplinary teams, learning to work in teams and learning to be externally orientated, to think in a problem set and think about how they might resolve a particularly identified problem. And learning about failure, learning about the challenges of innovation, how difficult it is, learning about how to ascertain risks and manage risks. So, I mean, it's a contribution. It's not the only answer, it's a contribution. But one thing that we can do across all the different disciplines is improve our education and training into people in their ability to be able to articulate and package their ideas of value to solve problems externally, whether in business or in society more generally.
Yeah, Mark, can I just add, I mean, I think the other thing that this pandemic has done is accelerate the way in which we use digital technologies to work together and to communicate. I mean, we're using Zoom today. You can all see the growth path of Zoom in terms of the number of users, in terms of what's happened to its value. That technology wasn't invented a month before the coronavirus. It was ready and waiting, and was already growing quite nicely. I mean, it was born out of WebEx that was spun out of Cisco in 2011. So, you know, it's nearly, the platform we're using today is nearly 10 years old. In fact, the digital tools that have supported us very nicely were there or thereabouts ready to go. They just needed something that triggered their acceleration. And some universities have got on the front foot and begun to use those very quickly. I think both University of Queensland and Imperial got into delivering their courses digitally, remotely to students very, very quickly. Others didn't. They didn't have the wherewithal to. So, we need to invest in many different things here. And let's remember that this acceleration of digital is unlikely to go backwards. We are in a different world now, and we will be working differently. That could be our friend in terms of accelerating the way in which we translate ideas into practice, right? But we've got to have strategies for that. We've got to have people who can support it and understand it. We've got to work with it. And there's a lot more that can be developed in the digital world that will create jobs, create growth, and support the economy. And I see that as part of the Great Reset. Actually, I'm quite hopeful that we'll see a lot of good things happening. And it surprises me just how many people are able to work in different ways from home or from wherever they are, in spite of the disruptions to travel.
Yeah, and I think that's been quite astounding as a result of this big experiment that we find ourselves in, of how well we have coped at some level, even though it's been hard. We've actually, as a society, it hasn't stopped. There hasn't been anarchy in the streets. So in some senses, I just want to ask a couple of questions that have come in the chat now. Rochelle is in your territory. She's actually a Queenslander working at Imperial White City. So she's asked this question. Obviously, web and IT companies, this whole Silicon Valley story, it's not that expensive, to build an app. Whereas some of the deep tech stuff, Rochelle's asking the question, what can we do to try and find innovative ways to be able to de-risk some of these technologies fast, without having to raise $5 or $10 million? Is there any ideas coming out of your experience that can help us do that faster?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let's not talk about raising $5 or $10 million. The vaccine research, you put a couple of noughts on the end of that count, yeah. And sometimes you have to get governments to put some money on the table to make things happen big. But there are things we can do fast, and Rochelle, it's good to hear from you, and I'm really intrigued that you're a Queenslander working in White City. That's great. I hope you're enjoying it there. I think the thing this type of crisis causes is for us to innovate our processes. Often it's something dreadful happening that forces the pace of translation and development of technology. We went from biplanes to the jet engine in 6 years during the Second World War. You try and tell people to work that fast nowadays, and they'll say, well, what's the reason to? Well, we've got that reason with the coronavirus, and we're changing the way we do our medical work and trials. Imperial's just announced its Human Challenge project, where we're deliberately infecting healthy people with the coronavirus so that we can test the vaccine more quickly. Now, that requires a shift from the regulators. It requires very careful process, but it's an innovation. It's actually not just totally around the coronavirus. We've done it once or twice before in recent times. But these crises stress test what we do and raise questions about, can we do it more quickly? Sometimes we can't do it more cheaply, but I think we can move regulations, and we can do things concurrently to speed up the process. And we have to at the moment, and that's why we're deliberately infecting healthy people with a very nasty virus in controlled circumstances so that we can get better tests done. Thanks,
David. I'm just going to share a word from our sponsors, which is the University of Queensland. And one of the things that I think we've realised, particularly over the last few months, is there's been a significant increase, and I think we've seen this globally. This increase in people, maybe stopping and thinking about where they're at in their career and in their trajectory. And so, for those of you that are watching either online, live, or watching this secondarily, UQ MBA program is one of the top university MBA programs in Australia, and also one of the top in the world. If you're interested in an MBA, then certainly have a look at our information night on Tuesday, the 10th of November. Or look at that online. And also, I guess I'd encourage you to think about around some of the thought leadership webinars that we're running. So we've got a business as usual, how to lead through times of crisis. So if you're interested in either further education, or if you're at the stage of your career and you're working out, look, this industry is in the problems, I'm looking for a change in direction, then certainly have a look at some of the courses that are offered at UQ. And if you're in the UK, certainly have a look at both Imperial and Oxford's professional development courses, because I think that's, in some senses, that's what we're seeing, is people have been going along really nicely, and all of a sudden a crisis happens and people stop and think. And one of the other sort of somewhat tongue-in-cheek rhetorical questions that came through was, how many scientists and engineers can also be entrepreneurs? And I think, David, in some senses, and Mark, both of you have talked to this, is that, it's not just about entrepreneurship. I guess it's really about getting that proximity to impact. That proximity might be through a partnership with a multinational. It might be through a partnership with a startup. It might be through a partnership with an NGO. If it's a policy, I think we undervalue the policy implications that universities have. And so really, in my mind, it's really about getting that proximity. I don't think, and I think, David, you'd agree with me, that most academics are not going to be, outstanding entrepreneurs. But what I think we're asking from them is to get closer. And I think maybe what you talked about with the digital change, I think that embracing of digital technology has brought everyone closer. Maybe a couple of comments on that as we round out.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of universities is that they are havens for a multiplicity of types of interests and people. And one of the reasons why ideas flow in ways that surprise us is that we have a huge degree of tolerance for different styles and different ways of developing ideas. And that's why, a university is not a pharmaceutical company and doesn't look like one. And I think you therefore see very many patterns in people's careers. And you're not going to see someone do a DNA nudge diagnostic company every year. You see it once or twice in someone's career, if that. And what we want to see in our universities is the possibility for people to succeed and the encouragement for it in multiple terrains, and for them to cross-fertilize and surprise us. I mean, the lovely thing about working in the leadership team at Imperial is that I was constantly being surprised by things that I wasn't expecting to see. Because when you're managing a university, you're not actually pulling levers that have direct results on what might happen. You're creating the conditions for success for other people. And running a company is a very different thing. You're first of all having one eye on who's invested in the company and what are the returns, and another eye on where is your market and who are your customers, and a third eye on who are your employees and are they working properly and happy to work. And that's a very different viewpoint from creating the conditions in an institution where surprising things happened if that institution is in good health. And I think that's one of the balancing acts for vice chancellors and leaders of universities, leadership teams, to get right. And that has to move right the way through departments and all the functions of universities. Sadly, we've moved in both Australia and in the United Kingdom too far into a league table mentality, where people want to measure one or two things and forget that actually the contribution to those one or two things takes a whole lot more things to happen. And they take things to happen that take longer time spans, that require investments of different sorts. And, universities like Imperial and Oxford know that. They're in it for the very, very long haul. And they take sensible decisions over different time spans. And some universities don't have that luxury and have become very process oriented. And I wouldn't expect many big ideas to flow out of those universities anytime soon.
Lisa Cavallaro, who's a good friend of mine, who's works in economic development with the Brisbane City Council, has asked the question, what's the role for government to try and bring about these things? How does, apart from just funding research, how can government play a role in bringing industry and university research together? Maybe
I mean,
maybe Mark.
Go on, Mark.
Well, yeah, government can do a lot of things in terms of providing facilities, for providing grants, research grants, through providing training opportunities, through their procurement policies in buying innovative goods, and supporting small firms. So the whole range of policies that Queensland's been experimenting with over the last 20 odd years. But I think one of the most important roles that government can play is that convening role in actually pulling parties together, incentivizing them to have conversations together, providing the facilities and opportunities for firms of different sizes to meet with universities and so on. If I may just say something, I mean, I agreed everything with what David was saying, and the big strategic issues are very important. But one of the most important signals I've seen here in the UK in encouraging people across all the different areas to think about how they connect is the research councils here asking researchers to determine or write about their pathway to impact of their research. I mean, this is not the clumsy thing that we have in the discovery grants and the ARC, where you have to say what you're going to discover before you actually do the research. It's much more subtle. It's saying, what's the likely pathway? Now, it can be very vague, but at least it starts thinking amongst researchers about how they're going to use their research and start thinking about the problem that they might be able to help solve. So the nature of the grants that government offer and the style of the grants that government offer can be important. The challenge, I think, I think David will agree with this, is that sometimes the tendency for government is to be too short term and to be very, very concerned with immediate deliverables and collaboration, often for the sake of collaboration, and ignoring that part of the research which refreshes the intellectual base of the institution, which may be long-term in orientation, problem orientated, driven by scientific questions and research questions rather than immediate practical problems. So I think one of the things that government could do is rethink their portfolio of investments in research to ensure that they maintain that stream of pure research rather than just applied research.
Yeah, let me jump in on that, Cameron, just to add something, because I agree with Mark. But of course, there are different rhythms across government, and we have funding councils that try and look after long term. And if I understand right, Lisa is part of the Brisbane government or the Queensland, the Brisbane government, right? Well, I think there's a lot you can do locally, and I bet you're sitting on a mountain of data that could be useful if it was mobilized in the right way through research and then back out into policy making decisions that you and your colleagues in Brisbane government have to make. You possibly do that already, but I bet there's more you can do. And I had the luxury of working for the Greater London Authority on their economic board for 4 years. And I was the chair of the Smart London board following the Olympics for 5 years. And we managed to liberate London's data from all sorts of orifices that were creating data where it was blocked up. And, it wasn't for us to decide who might find that data useful and who could craft it into some useful services, because we just didn't have the capacity to think like that. We made it available for entrepreneurs, we made it available for researchers. And there's some wonderful stuff come out that has helped policy making. For example, in right down at the micro level of street level, air pollution and health. How did we understand that? Well, we had the data to understand it, but we didn't have the means to process it. So collaboration with King's College London, London School of Economics and so on, using that data to come out with better policy. And that fuels research, it helps translation, it helps companies deliver services better, but it can't be done unless government gets involved and leads in new ways. And there's a huge amount here that government can do in proactively shaping the opportunity for better translation.
Yeah, thanks, David. And look, so I know we're out of time, David. You've got a call to jump on in a few minutes, and you're obviously very busy. So I so appreciate both of you taking the time. You're both in the UK, and David, congratulations on the PVC role at Oxford. I think that's a tremendous opportunity. I'm so excited to see what experiences you take out of Imperial over there. And Mark, looking forward to seeing you back here in Australia sometime when things get a bit more safer and settled. But look, I so appreciate the conversation, because I think what we've learned is really there's not a one size fits all. It is really about this orientation, and whether it's just entrepreneurial orientation or just an orientation towards impact, towards making a difference, and whether that's from a policy, a tech point of view, even just providing our students more opportunities to be able to work out how to change the world that they're in. I think what we're seeing, and one of the questions was, can universities survive? Well, what do universities have to do to survive? And I think the essence of our conversation has provided a bit of a blueprint for that. So look, I appreciate your time, guys. It's been a wonderful conversation, and again, I look forward to seeing you when the world is a much less crazy place. So thanks for your time. For those of you watching, there might be a poll coming up, so please fill that out. But again, please join me in thanking David and Mark for their time. Really appreciate it, guys. All the best.
Thank you, Cam. I look forward to coming back to Queensland when we can travel as well.
That would be great.
Love my visits there. Wonderful place.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Thanks, David. All the best.
Bye. Bye.